Okay, well, let us launch in. Paige, I'm going to rely on you to sort of be attentive to what I'm covering so you can fill in all the gaps I leave. Can?
Okay. Sounds good.
Okay, well, Melina ki aloha e oko poe haumana hoi hoi. Greetings to one and all. I'm Puakea Nogelmeier. I'm retired from the university after teaching Hawaiian language for 35 years. And while I was doing that, other things came up. So when I retired, I stepped right into a full-time position doing what I'd been doing part-time. So now I'm the executive director of Hawaiian, which is on your screen. You can find out more by looking it up, hawaiiaulu.org. And what we worked on, can I just quickly give you a 200-year history? Pay attention, don't forget anything. Okay, so Hawaiians are here for 1,000 years. Captain Cook shows up in 1778. The world shifts a little, but it doesn't change a great deal. But Hawaii is already pretty united. It's not quite together. So they are dealing with the West as a pretty unified social group, which is very different than other places. So that interaction is mostly guided from inside. It's important because 40 years later, missionaries arrive. And among a bunch of other things, they develop a writing system for Hawaiian. Now, they're only able to do it because they're so supported by the chiefs. They come in 1820. January of 1822, a new writing system is developed. Many of the chiefs were already learning to read and write in English, because the missionaries didn't speak Hawaiian yet, but they grabbed on to writing in Hawaiian, took it on as a national project, literally. The king at 13 years old proclaims, "Mine will be a nation of literacy." And in a generation and a half, 2 generations at most, there's universal literacy, higher than America, higher than England, higher than any place in Europe, except perhaps Scotland, which is obviously neurotic readership. I don't know. Anyway. So by 1940, the whole nation can read and write. It's to have the elite share that with the commoners is an unusual thing. So they start a school system. It's a real drive towards education and modernity. And so from 1822, they're writing letters, they're writing manuscripts, they're writing down things they know. But in 1834, they published the first Hawaiian language newspaper. And it's actually done at the Teachers College, but the whole nation wants it. So every issue is read by everyone throughout the islands. And then that's followed by another paper and another. And newspapers never stop. They become literally addicted to newspapers. And Hawaiian language newspapers continue to be published by the government or the church until about the late 1850s, 1861, it becomes an industry of its own. Independent press. It's financed by advertisement and by subscription. And so it explodes. The newspapers run for 114 years. They go all the way to 1948. But so the key in there is Hawaii is really changing a great deal. Lots of things are happening. It becomes a constitutional monarchy. It gets overthrown. It has a provisional government. It becomes a republic. It becomes a territory. All of that gets documented on the inside by Hawaiians and Hawaiian speakers, because Hawaiian kingdom actually isn't all Hawaiians, by the way. You could be a subject of the kingdom and not be Hawaiian. But you still had to read and write Hawaiian because that's where business happened up until about the turn of the century. English steps in and really becomes the language. In 1895, when the Republic happens, 1896, they pass a new resolution that all education will only be in English. Now, some kids haven't learned to speak any English yet, but that's the process in place. What happens with that is the new generation is trained in English. The older folks lose sort of the reason to use it. There's not places, there's not materials. And Hawaiian literally dies out. In 1970, they assumed that it would last 10 years and be off the face of the earth. which is pretty regular for the diminishing languages around the world. Well, in the 1970s, there was a revitalization program, and it didn't disappear. So now we have almost 50 years, or it's about 50, of revitalization, and it's actually a global success story. There's 25, 30,000 people who speak Hawaiian. Myself and Paige are playmates in this field. And there's lots of things going on. But that whole body of material, now in the course of that 114 years, 100 different newspapers published 125,000 pages, and this is Wall Street Journal size pages, of Hawaiian language material, of every kind of content that you can imagine. It's equal to 1.5 million or maybe even 2 million pages of material. And there's another million worth of government docs, manuscripts, archival records. So 2-3 million pages of stuff written in Hawaiian. And I did the book that I asked you to look at the chapters is I did a dissertation, 2003, I got that, where I looked at how much is there, and there's this much, and how much have we actually tapped into, how much has been translated and published, and it was 2%, maybe 3% of a couple of million pages. 97, 98% of it sat there for a century unnoticed, unlooked at, and every history book, every Facebook post that you've ever looked at was done without that material. And what is that material? That's Hawaiians talking about themselves. So imagine a history of Tokyo and Japan written by us, by people who visited, or written by folks who moved in, but not anything from someone who was born and raised speaking Japanese. Imagine what that would look like. That's what we've got in hand. It's a little hard to wrap your head around it, that how can an education system go on for 120 years and teach the same history that was flawed then? So anyway, in the 80s, and I want to be able to share a screen. So as a Hawaiian language teacher, we dug into this a little bit, but nobody had really ever mapped it. We had no idea what it was. And I was explaining to your prof that it was like going into a library with a flashlight and picking a piece, right? And taking it out. We might find an article and use it for 5 years in a Hawaiian language class, and then go find another one. It wasn't until we mapped what's really there that we started to turn the lights on in that library. And we did it because the immersion schools that made revitalization work needed materials all the time. Kindergartners had no materials, we wrote them. They became first graders, now we had to write materials. All the teachers that could do it were busy filling that up. And somebody had come to us, the profs, and said, who's making books for adults? You can get a degree at this university in Hawaiian language and never see a real book. It's all Xeroxes and printouts and whatever, but a real book. So I want to show you a book that we did, if I can, as you should be tired of my face by now. Hold on. So, and I don't know if once I share this screen, it'll stay with me, but I'm hopeful. Can you see that picture?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. In 1996, we pulled a history from the 1860s by Kamakau, and he had taken on educating his nation about their own history. From the birth of Kamehameha to the death of Kamehameha III, he did a weekly series for 6 years. We pulled it all out, we type-scripted it. This was for Hawaiian readers, and it was 1,000 pages long. We couldn't even publish the darn thing. So we cut it in thirds, and this was the first third. And it was a huge breakthrough for us. So, but it also dived us into the newspapers. So we started to see what else was there. Anyway, that was the stimulus. That book was the stimulus. We started to map that newspaper cache and realize how important it was. In 2000, we started to make digital images so it could be on the web. They'd been randomly available on microfilm. We did digital images from the microfilms because computers were a new thing. I can see all of you did not experience that part of the world. Okay, so before computers, before the internet, this was microfilms in a cold room without a printer, by the way. And then when printers came to microfilm readers, that was like this huge breakthrough. Now we have the internet and computers. We were able to make digital images right away. We were able to see how valuable it was to be able to dig back and forth through that. So we brought this to the university, which it was too new an idea and it was too far removed and too nebulous, and they just couldn't get it. So we went and set up a nonprofit, and the first nonprofit was called Ho'olaupai, just to make the digital images available on the web. And that ran for 9 years. We were able to get about 15,000 of them up out of, now there's 125,000. So there's a lot of math playing along in this, but 15,000 of them made it so apparent that there was material there that no one had ever seen. No one had ever, remembered. Incredible stuff. So that kept the drive going. In 2003, we set up Hawaiian, which that's the logo on my sheet there, because I wrote the book that I asked you to read the chapters of, and it described that, a couple of million, 2%. My friend came by and said, "What are you doing about it? We've got to fix that. We've got to keep publishing Hawaiian books, but we have to make them in English, because 95% of Hawaiians don't speak Hawaiian, and 99.9% of the general public don't, and they all need this knowledge. So we have to translate it all." So when I pointed out, there are no translators. And remember I told you about revitalization that happened from the 70s until today. That all happened without that couple of million pages in hand. So the people that were learning that language weren't familiar with what was in the background. So when you give them this stuff from the old times, it's really, really out of their reach. So we set up in 2003 for me to train translators. And that's what we have been doing since then. And so I'm going to share screen again. So I took on two, and and I'm hopeful that this will let me, here, look, there she is. Okay. I took on two, and we took a legend that was 500 pages long, the little sister of the volcano goddess. And it's this grand legend. It was published, the version that we picked was published in 1906, but it was actually published 12 different versions in the course of about 80 years, and none of them had ever been translated. And this is a fabulous story. It's sex, drugs, and rock and roll, all in Hawaiian, and had never been brought out. So I took two proteges. We translated the whole thing, published it. This is the Hawaiian version. The exact version was also put out in English, and the American Folklore Society said, "This is world literature. Where has it been?" So we just keep driving on. We keep driving on. And we have continued to train and go on. Now, I am bringing this closer to where you are, I think, is that we kept training. We trained two. We allowed them to bring on two under each of them. Now we have six. Each of them were allowed to take on two. This kept growing every 2 years. We ended up, right now we have 14 in training, because we stopped after the last intake of 8, and actually we had 9. But my bandwidth was, that was it. That's it. So we carried them forward, and we did a 2-year project called Mahuahua, because we just feel we're doing service. We're trying to unpack that couple of million pages. We can't unpack it all, but if we can give you enough to show you that it's an important sandbox to play in, it'll make you go do your own work there. So we took them 2 years further into it. We did a project called Mahuahua, which instead of doing these great tomes, we gave them a field of study and said, go into the whole million pages. Find everything you can on this topic. You have 6 months. Chart all of the articles that are relevant, and then translate every week some portion of it. So teams of three, 4 teams of 3 worked on this for 2 years. So we have 16 ohina, which are just collections. And ohina might have 1,000 articles, and 100 of those are translated. That's a resource that I'm able to put on your desktop. But that's still not enough. If you're a teacher in an immersion classroom or an English classroom, you're dying already. You don't have time to be. We're handing you gold nuggets, but they don't have time to make jewelry. So we launched into a second program. Oh, I do want to show just the last, the text that we did with the very first 2 of our trainees. Now it takes years to put this into shape, but this is coming to press this year. And it's that, the picture I showed you first with Kamehameha's picture on the front cover, this is that same text, but now it'll be Hawaiian on the left, English on the right in a single volume. So, but it took 8 years to develop that. I mean, some of these are really, it's not the fastest work in the world, but it really is pretty rewarding. Anyway, we finished Mahuahua and we jumped into, it was a new idea of what do we, especially with COVID. I mean, teachers are screaming for materials on the web, and most of the stuff on the web is garbage. When I tell you that all the history that you learned was all done without ever looking at this, well, the stuff on the web didn't even look at the history you learned. Much of it is really, it's badly done by someone in Texas who has no access to resources, basically. It's really, a lot of it is tragic. And so the education system is set up rather badly for that. So I want to share screen again, if I can. And let me see if I'm able to pull up a web page. That's what I'm after. But it takes me a minute sometimes to navigate. Paige, was that a good coverage of a couple of 100 years of history?
Yes, sure.
Holding? Okay. I'm just gonna grab, oh, here. Before we go there, okay. Here's a resource. Can you see the OHA website?
Yes.
Okay. This is called papakilodatabase.com. We'll get you all the links for these. But in the course of our doing the digital images, the Office of Hawaiian Affairs created, this is a huge online database. And it has material on land, on genealogy, on, I can't even remember what that next one is. Oh, the Mahele, all the land division stuff. And then here's the newspapers. And in this one site, now we have 65,000 images of searchable text. So I can now search that whole collection, and I'm on a keyword search. So if I was to look for Manoa, which is where you are, this would tell me that in my newspapers here, I need to move this out of my way, I'm sorry. There are 5,900 articles related to Manoa. Now there's duplication on this because there may be a type-scripted page and an original of the same piece. But this would pull up, and I'm going to clip in an article. This is what a Hawaiian newspaper looked like. It looks like any other newspaper, basically, except it's in Hawaiian. So I can search. Oh, I can search almost anything that you want to. I mean, that's a huge block of things going on. So, but I want to take you again. I'm going to pull back to a share screen, go back to that same old site, and take you to our site. We need to go to, this is our site. And if you go on here, this, oh, are you seeing Ki Papa page?
Yes.
Okay, this is the Ki Papa website. You can register for this as a student or teacher. Just, they ask, where do you teach? Well, kids, we all teach. You might be teaching at your college dorm room, you might be teaching at the bar, but we're all teachers, okay? So right now they've taken 3 of those collections and put them up on the web. So when you look into something, they map the content that has been brought in place. So we are actually connecting here a little bit. This is Independence Day for Hawaii is 1843, and it's November 28th. And the story of how Hawaii was the very first little nation outside of Europe to be acknowledged as a peer nation. Before other little nations like Japan and China, Hawaii was recognized as a peer nation of England, France, and America. So kind of large. And this is the story of that. And this is the narrative piece of that. So a teacher can walk in, and this is the narrative of that sequence. The characters, and this is available to everyone in English or Hawaiian. If it's a Hawaiian resource like these, it's brought out in English. If it's an English resource, oftentimes it's summarized in Hawaiian and might or might not actually be. So this is the entire timeline of that. If I was to look in, I mean, that's the home on it. If I wanted, there should be a timeline here, right? No. But there would be a mele that would go with it. I need one of the timelines, so let me get back to home base. I'm sorry, I'm not the best navigator on this. But you will learn to play. Yeah. Take me home, take me. And there must be a back home, right? Nope, that took us in. Come on, Dad. I was looking for the timelines because that's where your mapping becomes apparent. Oh, well, let me take this one. Because this should have a timeline. Oh, that's because it's buried over here. So there is a timeline that goes with this sequence. This is a different thing. This is the Restoration Day. Hawaii's independence was seized and then was given back. And this is the entire sequence of that. So from when it first, the factors were building up, 1836, 1840, 1842, 1843 is when it actually happens. And this would give you a block of resources that could be used to explain that particular part of the event. And if I was to, some of them have 2, some have 5, they'll be explained what they are. And walking into the timeline of that, I'm sorry. Instead of the timeline, if I had chosen the narrative, it should have given me that's up here. Remember where you are. So this has timeline, curriculum. So this would be the whole narrative on how Restoration Day even happened. So it's the whole sequence, much like the last one that I showed you. And don't be mistaken, this is simple mapping. That's all it's about. But to map it as a chart. Curriculum, now this is broken into, they've developed curriculum for K through 2, 3 through 6, 7 through 9, and 10 through 12. There are everything from readings, games, lectures, escape rooms, and songs. And we ended up composing songs. Can I show you a song? Do you have the patience for a song?
Sure. I'd like to see the escape rooms. I'm kind of curious.
Oh, wait. You know what? And let me look for them. Let me ask somebody. Paige, do you know where those are? Now, this was written for Restoration Day. Is that loud for you guys? You heard this. Wait for it. There you go. Hi. And I am not sure exactly where the escape rooms are, and I tricked around. There's one for kindergarten, there's one for high school, there's one for in the middle. They're actually pretty cool. It's after readings and games and whatnot. You have to be able to identify the characters or identify to get into the next room. So, but the idea is we map things. That last one on Restoration Day, it actually sort of steps aside after they've studied the event and the characters and the games. Now, when you think of the idea of restoration, where else does that apply? And actually every image in that song had to do with some kind of a restoration that has occurred, and certainly the lyrics do. So it's sort of a extrapolation from the concept. So that's how, I mean, we're digging in the sandbox and we're digging deep. We're trying to enable that knowledge to get reintegrated by literally mapping it out and making a map that others can follow. So, I mean, maybe that's the message of my visit today is, you know, we found a huge resource, and in trying to just unpack it, mapping is actually helping us to make it accessible. So I think there's 100 other ways this could be approached, and hopefully what we're doing becomes a model for others to either follow or build on or expand. the system that we set up for Hawaiian, where I was personally training on these characters, we brought that to the university only 15 years later and set up the Institute for Hawaiian Language Research and Translation. And that's where Paige, who had already been my student, but we cajoled her into, come on in and work, you know, it's fun work, you'll like it. Can I ask Paige to jump in, and do you have things to add to take us forward or fill in the gaps that I might have danced over?
Are you leaving? Or you're
No.
leaving now? Are you gonna
I'm 15 minutes out, but you know, where I was trying to keep it to a half an hour, pretty crisp. My own peers would be wildly impressed. I usually ramble for an hour and a half.
Well, I have a question for both of you, but so let's, so Paige, do you want to add to what he was saying? And then I've got a question for you guys.
I mean, what I do is really specific. It's a sliver of the corpus of work. So maybe you might want to ask your question first since he's here.
Yeah, let's launch questions and then see. Actually, Paige is working on a sliver, but it's the hard edge application of what we're doing is what was happening at. We tried to make this whole body, this corpus, accessible to everybody, whether they're in journalism or medicine or biology and I should have pulled up the hurricane article, but I think I sent it to you. I mean, we pulled up old weather stuff that showed there'd been a hurricane that they didn't even know about on Hawaii Island in 1871. It changed the trajectory. They were trying to drop hurricane insurance and building codes because in the last 100 years, they thought Hawaii Island was immune. Well, it turns out they weren't immune. They're just wildly overdue for a big slap. So it's a good thing that that information came out, before things got. Isel hit, there was $20 million in damage. And it was still covered by insurance and building codes because they had not made progress with dropping that. So there's relevance to what we're up to. So yeah, pose your question.
I have two questions.
Yes.
It's Joseph here. I haven't left for New Orleans yet. It's Joseph.
Oh, there you are. Aloha. Aloha. Joseph.
The first question is, can you make an escape room that's doctoral level so that Julian can never leave his office? Kidding.
You know what? The escape rooms that we have, just open up the Hawaiian language page. That'll keep you locked in because all of our escape rooms are in both languages, right?
My question is, what's the biggest gap in the archives that hasn't been found yet? I was going to ask.
Okay, and we're still missing probably 40,000 pages of newspapers.
Well,
No.
what years?
It's a total random, there might be a collection down at the Bishop Museum of, say, the full run of something like Kahoku Okapaki Pika, which ran weekly for 2.5 years. But they're missing 5 issues. It's terror. Or there might be, it's similar like that. Just imagine, or there are big blocks. There are also newspapers we did not even know were in press that we just had not found a reference to yet. Found one at the Library of Congress. We didn't even have it on the record. And then we have the one that the story came about the little sister of the volcano goddess was Kana'i Aupuni. And we knew it was published in 1905, 1906. We found in the basement of Kauaiahao Church, the only copy that anyone has ever seen of the next 2 years that just nobody had saved, I guess. It didn't show up in the state archives. It's not in the Bishop Museum. They had a full, clean copy. So we happen to have a wonderful digital set of what we did not even know had been published. So we're still mapping, but there are huge blocks of pieces. There are remarkable legends or histories where we're just missing the middle block, or you're missing a really critical piece of it. And until we find it, I know of one, there was it's a 40 installment series on ancient Hawaiian religion, but it's missing the first chapter. So the framework is still not in hand. what's a guy to do? There must be other questions.
Well, so there is a, a general thing that I was hoping you could speak to a little, and they, I was thinking everybody in this room probably has some thoughts about. And I just map out 4 positions, 2 that we read about. One of you and I had talked about it a bit when we met this weekend about Noe Silva, and then your position. So 4 altogether, two people who disagreed in the readings that they did. And then different perspectives about this, I think, about the Hawaiian newspapers. So what they read was, and you all, I was, I just kind of ran out of time because I was going to share these quotes with you, Puakea, and with Paige. But if you guys look in the shared folder, I called this Media Power and Interpretation, and I pulled out these quotes. So there was one guy right at the dawn of journalism history, when in the first issue that they published of our journal, Journalism History, 1974, who did an article called The Problem of Journalism History. And they all read it. It's a brief but very influential, groundbreaking essay. Are you familiar with it?
No, but I can imagine that I could understand what the problem would be.
Well, so it was, he calls it Whiggish history, which is the idea that there's this assumption of progress, that over time things, one important person after another marching on into a better and better future. And this is overlapping, the Whiggish history thing is overlapping with great white man history, where it's one, great newspaper editor or publisher after another patching. And so he comes along in 1974. It says, whether you agree or disagree, this is a very boring and dry and limited way of looking at our past, and it needs to be ventilated. And so he's sort of suggesting that there's some relationship between sort of social consciousness and what you find in the pages of a newspaper. And at one point he says, and I just ask you guys, this is a quote from what you read, to think about this vis-a-vis Hawaiian newspapers. He says, we do not study the black press, and he's thinking black press going back to the black newspapers before, during the day of slavery, when Frederick Douglass was taught himself to read. And, he says, we do not study the black press because it passively reflects black consciousness. The press is not merely the source of data about black social history. Black consciousness is forged in, it exists in the black press. Now, this other author, scholar, David Paul Nord, disagreed with him. And he said, you can't just kind of look at these papers and interpret them and interpret what's in them like it's like this is the English department and these are pieces of literature, you're looking at novels or whatever, and you're just interpreting whatever. Like if you're a media historian, you look at Bambi, you've got to look at the fact that it's produced by the Disney Corporation, and so he's making the point that he quotes Clifford Geertz, which I'm sure, Puakea, you're familiar with, as, man is an animal suspended in webs of, significance he himself is spun. And David Paul Nord says, no, men and women are suspended in the web spun by others. And he makes a point what I was looking for in this, and I don't know if you guys remember, but I related to someone who worked for years for newspapers. Newspapers are a bit like a newspaper production is a bit like making tin cans. When you print out stories, you're part of a factory. You may work in the newsroom, but you are factory workers. And he said it's a lot more akin to a sweatshop than to any sort of literary salon or whatever. And so I gave these two polar opposites, and the question is, where do when we read Hawaiian newspapers, is this Hawaiian consciousness forged and, being born within the Hawaiian newspapers? In other words, is this coming right out of the roots? Or do you have to take a more jaundiced eye, more skeptical eye of what you're looking at and say, these papers themselves are, where does this fall? What is your take? You quote Foucault, right? And Edward Said at the beginning of your introduction, right?
About control and issues of control. But, I would see the problem of journalism history would be the need to almost look, well, it depends on which field you're looking into. But for the Hawaiian newspapers, I think you almost have to look with a spider's eye, because there isn't a single newspaper, there isn't a single consciousness, but each newspaper is its own sort of the web that they weave and the web others weave. It's the mix. So you have to step into it with the awareness of that multifaceted. Now you have to imagine in the 1880s, there's only 120,000 people in these islands, perhaps maybe it's 150 max. And there are 9 newspapers running at one time. As if you didn't like what you were seeing in the newspaper, you could start your own, by God, if you had a little money in your pocket, and make things happen and make sure that your perspective was addressed. So there's a number of them that are opposing each other radically. And I'd have to ask, when you read, I don't know if you do read the Star Advertiser, when your prof speaks to the industry of that, do you feel that newspaper reflects you? Would you make a newspaper like that? I don't. A piece of it does, which is why I still subscribe, and so parts of it do. And in the 1880s, many people subscribed to 5 and 6 newspapers. There was talk back and forth on them. I think you have to step into it, like knowing that Bambi is made by Disney. You have to know, okay, what was the foundation of this newspaper? It was often explained what the worldview would be, or what their focus would be. We're not going to deal with any religious aspects. We're going to deal with clean politics, or we're only a literary focus. We're only going to, but then they pick the most political stories to publish. It's being able to step into that, like I say, with a spider's eye, to be able to try and catch the many different aspects that are at play. And what you'll see, and so like Noe Silva can research these, there's a dozen people who are digging in deeply right now. Some of them are digging with a very clear trajectory on what they want to find, and they'll find exactly what they want to find. Others are a little more broad in their net, and they're going to find a lot of other pieces. I think even with my best broad mind, good intentions, and depth of analysis, we will only scrape the surface, at this point. If we continue to build on that, someone can build on my work, they can build on Noi's work, or the other people that are playing in the field, and take it a step further and say, well, yeah, she didn't see this part of it, or didn't take into account this, or he didn't address this whole issue. That enriches it all. So I think there'll be work for the journalistic historians for probably forever. Start mapping so those who come behind you have something to follow.
So I think a lot of our students understand 19th century Hawaii as a colonial project, a story of oppression and
Right, which I would disagree with vehemently. Because once you read what the Hawaiians themselves were writing, they never felt colonized. They did not feel imposed upon. They felt they were in charge. End of discussion. How can you don't colonize an independent nation. You can impose yourself, you can, cajole, and you can threaten, and you can economically beat them to death, but you don't colonize them. And most of the change and impact that happened in Hawaii was guided by, approved by, or initiated by a Hawaiian.
And so you see the entire story of annexation in the Hawaiian language, through the Hawaiian newspapers, through that lens. And
I do.
The city with the kingdom losing control of itself through.
Yep, right up until what happens. Really, what I say is that, it wasn't colonization that overthrew the Hawaiian kingdom. It was cash. It's capitalism. The whole 1874 Reciprocity Treaty allows for a brand new whole elite group, very moneyed. Hawaii never had a lot of money. Suddenly there's a whole bunch of really rich people in the country. they aren't satisfied with being rich. They want to be rich and powerful. Bingo, overthrow, step forward. America was already ready to put things in its pocket. Hawaii was handed to it basically. And it happened to be at a very good time. They were doing expansion war into the Pacific. And Hawaii is just the best port on this side of the globe. So, you know what? I'm going to have to pull out. Is this you, Namahana?
It is.
Ah, oh yeah, I'm sorry. Paige, take over. Or are there any burning questions before I jump out? How's that? I'm sorry. I'm going to have to take off. That's why. I'll come back and visit. If this still is relevant to you guys, I'm pretty available. I'm pretty accessible.
You guys,
I'm very fond of Cindy and Paige.
you know, and having them be able to arm themselves with some more time to read and study.
Yeah. Yeah. If you want to play on, that's the thing to do is look, go and register in the Keep Up a site, look through the kinds of materials that they're developing and know that that is an intentional mapping project. And I understand that you have a mapping app that sounds fabulous. We made up our recipe in the kitchen. You know, we didn't have an app. So what's there is sort of a homemade, but we're very happy and it's moving forward very well. So there's lots to do there. I think Paige could probably talk to you about some of the relevance of, like I say, it's the knife on the butter, you know, doing the job. So let me leave that in your hands. And really, Paige knows everything that I do. I just have known it longer. That's all. So
Yeah, I took notes this time, but I'd like to follow up both on what maybe they could read in advance of if you do want to return, and also some questions for you for this chapter on digitization I'm writing this month. So if we could follow up, that would be fantastic. And
okay, yeah, you do readings. There's stuff to play with. Run around in the Hawaiian site. Look on that Papakilo database site. There's lots there in English and in Hawaiian, but it's a huge resource that otherwise you'd never know was there.
All right, well, thank you so much.
Okay, mahalo ya oko. Okay, awiho.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Now, I do want to say to you guys, you know, so you understand the political, if we had Noe Silva in here, she, you know, read the opening lines of Aloha Betrayed. She says there is a mythology, you know, that Hawaiians passively accepted annexation. So like kind of politically, these guys disagree, right? And scholars often very much disagree. Sometimes they get nasty with each other, right? Unless, you know, even though it's like, you know, there's no need, you know, often when they do, when they get angry at each other, then we come along as a younger generation of scholars and go, why are they getting so mad? There's like so much truth on either side. Couldn't these people not yell at each other or whatever? And not that these two do. I mean, Noe Silva was Puakea's student. And so they have a, you know, but I don't want to like oversimplify and suggest that there's some dialogue or something between those two. I'm just saying you're going to find different perspectives about, you know, very different perspectives of this history. And it's important, you know, as a historian to appreciate the complexity, you know. And so like Avion, you guys are doing, you know, the war in the Philippines. And we've talked about colonialism, the fact, for example, that the whole war against the Philippines was billed as an anti-imperial war in the first place. Like these histories can quickly get very complicated and confusing, and a lot of times, which doesn't take away from like when there are crimes, you know, against humanity or whatever that occur in history, that they don't need to be looked at squarely. It's just that you know, you need to be careful and accurate and in order to understand the truth of history, you know, and it can be hard to pull apart from a distance of 100 years or whatever, right? So he has a very interesting take because he has a much more, he's not saying, no, you know, they're the victims of imperialism, you know, he has a much more nuanced view of it than that. And you know, in your own studies, you may end up agreeing or disagreeing with it, you know. And, you know, I think it wouldn't be too much to say. It sounds to me, you know, to be blunt about it, that Puakea took a lot of heat for that in the politics of Hawaii over the, am I correct in saying that? I mean, you know, you guys would know better than me, but you know, for whatever people believe in, it's not necessarily cost-free when you are out there in public with a certain interpretation on an issue that's controversial, right? And emotional for a lot of people. So Paige, do you want to pick up from there? And then, I don't know, I mean, maybe, well, wait, before I ask you in, I just want to ventilate a little bit. Does any of you guys, you know, Puakea did the talking, I've done the talking. Let's hear from you guys. What are your thoughts about all this so far before we move to the next step?
I was just interested to know more about whether the Hawaiian language is still preserved in newspapers as it was before, and whether we're seeing that shift now regarding that.
Well, what do you guys think?
Do we have more Hawaiian newspapers now as we did before? And if not, with the realization that it is important to preserve the culture and the language, so are we going to see that in the future? Maybe more Hawaiian newspapers, more language incorporation into digital text and stuff in print media?
Have you seen a Hawaiian language newspaper?
I haven't.
That's.
They stopped, I think he says the last publication was when, in the 40s?
48.
48.
And then when we met with him, he said, because I asked him, I was like, remember I asked him, I said, what about 48 to now? And he goes, no. And he said newsletters. There were some newsletters, right? Like some things.
Small, I think small correspondence newsletters, no.
I'm
That's it.
surprised that they got nearly 50 years into the 20th century with Hawaiian language newspapers, given that, what was the term he used? And I you know, I don't want to interrupt him, but I think he used the term banned for the Hawaiian. I know there was an
There's
aggressive
a-
effort.
So I think everybody always uses the word ban or outlawed or illegal. I think if you look at the actual terms, it was a language preference policy. So the language in the policy itself is that schools will become English preference schools. And you'll hear it in later history because like my grandfather was Japanese, went to McKinley because Roosevelt was the English standard. If you spoke good English, you could go to Roosevelt. If not, you had to go to another school. You know, so throughout history, we're creating class divisions, even through language, even through English. So I've also, usually the end date is the date that shocks me because that is far. It's far into, so what happens though is the preference is in place, but in actual implementation, what ends up happening is that teachers ban students from using Hawaiian in their classrooms. So really, it's kind of the implementation and interpretation of the policy into the classroom.
So who imposes these preferences? Where is it?
The Department of Education. So today, I believe that preference, I don't know if it still stands actually, I should probably take a look. We do have immersion schools. But generally, if you go into a classroom, what do we do with students who come from families who don't speak English? We put them in an ESL classroom. So the system is still in an English preference mindset, you know, in March. I think what I learned quite recently, because I was teaching at the university, I was teaching the the free classes that UH was having for Hawaiian language. The boy who actually proposed the idea, he's from, oh, I can't remember where he's from. Anyway, I will remember at some point, but in his country, that's what he thought. He said, oh, when I got here, I thought I would hear Hawaiian. I thought I would learn Hawaiian because I got here and everybody speaks English. I go, yes. There's a whole thing, right? But he, in his mind, was like, why? And he explained to me that where he's from, they have had civil wars over their language. Here, if you look at the, in the newspapers, I would say probably around the 1860s, there are already some articles being written about the loss of language. So they're already noting in their, I had to write an article for the latest value of the implementation. And so I pulled up a bunch of things where they're basically, people were writing saying, you know, our children are no longer speaking Hawaiian, they speak English. There's an allusion there in the way that I translated it, that it's saying like, well, their language is as white as their skin probably should.
Well, that starts with the first Hawaiian language newspapers, right? Which were not very, as now I just know this history from reading Noe Silva and not, from getting far enough along with Puakea's work yet, but it was not welcomed by the missionaries, the first Hawaiian language papers, which were publishing English language. An English language newspaper, right? With Hawaiian language sections.
Colombo, Hawaii was in Hawaiian, that's 1834.
Mhm.
I would have to double back on what Nainai wrote. And I've sat in, I've worked with Puakea for like 8 years of my life,
Yeah.
but I've also taken classes from Nainai. They do not get along. You can't have them in the same room without feeling uncomfortable, which is actually not Puakea. I gotta give him credit. He walks into a room where people hate him often. I can't do that. I probably make people uncomfortable when I walk in a room and I don't like you.
Mhm.
So he's, they have some and I think even within this setting to keep in mind a lot of why you cannot ever take away the work that he's done. But the crux of where a lot of the tension is because he's not ethnically Hawaiian. Right, so
It's
when
not Kanakamo'o.
yeah, like people never know, and to me it doesn't really matter because he dedicates his work to doing things that we're doing, but it is a point of tension for like anybody in the field. It is a point of
And that
tension.
happened, he told us in the 90s, he became kind of the poster child of the Haole, Hawaiian scholar, even though he was really pioneering, it sounds like.
Yeah, he was, and he was learning from Hawaiians. He was sort of adopted by Hawaiians. So I think the racial tension has to do with the struggles of today, right? And then creating his real goal is to create access to knowledge. We're in a place where sometimes that knowledge has to be translated because not enough people who need the knowledge speak the language to get in the door. And so that's the angle they come from. A lot of the other professors come from an angle of this is ours. Why? And also the fear of knowledge being misused, which has happened before. So they feel very proprietary over, like, usually when I do conference talks, some professors have sat in and they've all been very nice to me, because I do think they look at me, they're either gonna look at me like I'm an extension of him or I'm my own person. So, but they will ask, like, when we do translation work, who owns that translation? Which is not really the question they're asking. What they're asking is for the intellectual property, right? And so when we put a translation out there, the translation is mine. I did the work. He always has to approve everything. So, it's his, it's ours, the translation. So that's why it's always important we give them the original, because if they have their own interpretation, then they're very welcome to, raise that. And even between translation styles, his is very, and I think he logged out. I don't remember the terms. Two terms for the translation styles, like dynamic and something else. He sticks very close to what's written, which generates kind of clunky in English. And after he retired, I worked with Kapali Lyons out of the religion department. He's also fluent in Hawaiian, who's also not Hawaiian. People love Kapali. He was so, working with them was very, very different. His style, much more dynamic, much more looking at it and, well, how would we say that in English today? So the translations are smoother when you read it in English. There might be a little more interpreted there, but just reading it, if you speaking or even me writing it, it's like, oh yeah, that's how we say it. But with him, you cannot take too many liberties. It's a fine line. So just in the physical translation part, there are always going to be differences. It always depends on who's doing the translation. I think when it's presented to the public, it should always have a translation credit, it should always have a citation. You know, you should always be giving the
Yeah.
original. But I do notice that even in like the GSO now, like, supposed to go to a meeting on Thursday, they struggle with presenting translations next to the original, next to not an original translated work, but using the language. I also work part-time for Hawaii Public Radio, so I'm very used, it didn't even strike me the politics of translation, and what it means to provide even a short translation next to one word, because it's required at HPR. There's no way they're ever gonna right now let anything stand alone. So we, you know, it didn't even strike me, and then GSO does a result, and my friends just up in arms, you know, like, by putting the translation, you have made Hawaiian decorative and not, you know, the focal point, which I kind of forgot in my day-to-day things. So I think between the differences in who owns the knowledge, do we gatekeep the knowledge or do we open the floodgates? I lean more towards, I don't know, I want to know what's in there, so I'm going to go look. And I think a lot of Hawaiians who learning the language today is a privilege for them. It is a privilege. Language learning is still locked in the walls of an institution, but they have to pay to get it. So I want them to know what's there. I want to give them something so that they try, at least they know it's there. And in their mind, they know, like, if I learn, you know, if I can get my own language skills up to par, what could I actually find? You know, which, and I think he's right in terms of storytelling, and how do you take all of this that exists in weird spaces? They're online, but not all of them. And they're in weird, they're at the museum, they're at the mission houses, they're in private collections, you know, because it's just people who happen to keep, you know, some are in the archives, the state archives. So how do you take that and how do you package it out? I consulted this girl from Hawaiian Studies, did her master's a couple years ago, and she made a GIS map online so that she could pin things to the location. So that you could look at a digital map, click on the location, get pictures from the archives, articles, and then the hard part, and why I had to sit with her about it, is her Hawaiian's not that good. So how can she pull up and read and filter through and know what she should be using? It's one thing she could have just put up the original, but she definitely couldn't translate it. So it's really like looking at how do we make it relevant. And it is relevant, but how do you catch people so that they know it's relevant?
Yeah, and you know, I mean, I don't know, I hope this is all clear. You know, I'm circling back to readings at the beginning, we did at this beginning of the semester, but so those guys who were writing in the 70s about what they envisioned your generation of media historians would be doing. And what they're saying is, you know, and they're speaking, Carrie's somewhere on the East Coast, maybe David Palmer's in the Western. The thing is, whether you encounter newspapers that are the black press and are anti-slavery, or the Hawaiian language newspapers, or any of the abolitionist press, or the American, you know, just a newspaper from any period, right? There, you know, Carrie is like got this open-hearted thing, and where you could see with Carrie this idea of like, hey, maybe a newspaper is a bunch of people in Hawaii who have their own, they're a community or they're a town or they're somehow connected, and they get their wherewithal, they get the money together, and they publish their voice. And he's saying that's a very important part of understanding what a newspaper is. And in doing so, they build culture from the ground up, that's where it's forged. You know, he uses that word forged. And Nord has that opposite point of view, right? Now, like I said, you're gonna see, you see a similar thing if you want to look at it with, you know, Puakea and Noe Silverware. They're sticking out very like dramatically different. Oh, I don't want to reduce it by saying black and white, but in a way, very black and white polarized positions. Like Nord's like, no, this is about employees writing for some overlord who's like dictating how they put it, which if you've ever worked for a newspaper, yeah, they work my ass off, but nobody told me what to write. I wouldn't put it quite that way. I I may go in, to work every day with certain biases from a New England, raised, private school educated kid or whatever. But I write what I write, but still, he's saying, well, you've got to look at that, you can't look at that naively, is what he's saying, And so I just thought, did everybody get that from the readings, or is that, I hope that's at least clear now, And it's a real mystery to me about especially because it's in Hawaiian, about the Hawaiian language newspapers, given all the fraught history, the fact that the kingdom did fall, and now it's part of America. You look at, it's one thing to talk about the missionary published newspapers, or the Hawaiian section, the Hawaiian language section of the missionary-based newspapers. But what about any given Hawaiian newspaper at the time? Can you say it could be anything on that spectrum, right? Of people who, Noe Silva looks at the Hawaiian language newspapers as a voice of resistance, as an indigenous voice. And I think David Paul Nord might, be like, well, not exactly. And even Puakea would say, well, money was an influence on the kingdom no longer becoming a kingdom. So you got to look at, any of the sources you guys look at with thinking that, there's this spectrum of what I'm looking at. And if I look at it, if I look at a, what is it? How do you pronounce it? Moele? The Moele, the stories, the legends.
Molelo.
What?
Molelo.
Molelo. So you can interpret one of those, and a lot of them are political inherently, right? But you can also look at it and say, are the Molelo, is this one or is the other one, is that in here in this paper in this year while this was going on there for a reason, that is somehow top down dictated or whatever. It's not what it seems.
Yeah, so what Noine uses in her classes a lot, and I don't know if he sent it to you, but there is like an index, a newspaper index. And it's each publication that it's Esther Molokini, part of her thesis, gives you the run years and then the editors throughout time. So yes, they really fluctuate depending on who's the editor. The longest running paper of Puakea was The Independent. It began as it began to push back at the very missionary heavily run papers at the time. It was supposed to be The Independent. It was still run, usually all of them, all the editors are their friends for the most part. But it did start as an independent, and you can find a lot of very Hawaiian, strong voiced things in their articles and stories. And then at some point in the shift, right before and around annexation, when the editors shift, and depending on who's funding the paper, later it becomes a pro-annexation paper. And then very sort of missionary leaning. So they do fluctuate depending on how long they last. And then you have Kahai Hawaii, who was started by a Hawaiian national to push back against the cool, they have these, and he's right. They just kind of get together and they can start the press, but it does fluctuate, I think, for Hawaiian language newspapers and Hawaiian history on who the editor is. But you also see the change in people that I focused on, weather is a very broad, that's not the right scientific term, but I looked at tsunamis, eruptions, and earthquakes. And I get everything. I get from the plain view of this happened today at this time, smoke, fire, we ran, X number of people died. But within a lot of those articles, I'll also get, and we had to pray to Jesus because Jesus is going to save us, and it's fascinating. Sometimes I see Pele and Jesus in the same article. We're talking about the woman of the pit is erupting. We're going to pray to Jesus.
Well, and another thing that you guys could bring to the table here that, is something to think about with what you're doing in graduate studies right now and what you could be doing, especially if you carry this forward to the doctoral level, is that Paige and Puakea, and none of these people are media. None of them are media historians. And so what theoretically a media historian could bring to the table in studying this stuff, it isn't happening because there's only so many people, right now who can translate the Hawaiian or whatever else to say, what were the newsroom practices? What were common Orthodox newsroom practices for a newspaper in 1860 or 1870? Because I can tell you, like, legends appearing every day in the daily newspapers, that's weird. Like, that's not usual, like, for an American newspaper. And what does it mean that that's even, and to what extent did they have, things that we would recognize as standard newspaper practices? Or when they're different, why are they different? Now, if you're not a media historian, it probably doesn't even occur to you to ask that question, to think about what are their news values, what are their news routines, do they fit with news routines? But that can really unlock, because a lot of historians and cultural people like Puakea did a tremendous amount of work to come at this from a certain scholarly perspective. And so he's bringing a lot of intellectual firepower to the table just to get the stuff translated, right? So what he's not bringing to it is like, wait a minute, these aren't just sources of history. These are media, these are sources of media history. And as media historians, this is where the David Paul Nord stuff about institutions and everything really comes in, because it's like, we understand the way these structures function, how they exist. And so we have a whole unique set of analytical tools that we can bring to a conversation like this that unlock meanings that are there. It's just, I don't translate wine. I haven't spent the time, so I can't, but if I were to look at the stuff, as a media, and I'm not really a 19th century media historian. I'm like mid-20th, early to mid-20th century media is really my wheelhouse. But it's like, that's what's involved in that kind of scholarship, right? And I'm just saying, heads up, because you guys are all calm. We have debates, right? Whether you guys are media in a media program or not, but like to the degree that you are, or that's what you want to do, that's a lot of what you guys can bring to the table, with your degree and coming from where you're going, right?
The other thing I just wanted to have Paige mention is the importance of Puakea's work is that you can look at a newspaper from the early 1800s and you can look at a newspaper from the late 1800s and you can translate a word that has a different meaning. So you not only have to understand the Hawaiian language, you have to understand exactly what was happening during that time in history to be able to translate it correctly. And so Puakea can train, hundreds of people in the Hawaiian language, but he has to really understand and train people on exactly what was happening in the different times of history to translate it correctly.
Oh, yeah, there's lots of those very specific point in time references that I totally missed. In English, I was like, oh, that's what I missed thing. I'd be like, no.
Well, and your example of God and Pele in the same reference in the same thing is a good, which I connected to what you're saying about the words, is that hopefully one of the things you guys are learning about history through this class that I find one of the most fascinating is that you realize these people lived in a different reality. Like, they saw reality differently. And if you really want to be able to see things through the eyes of someone at a different time than you have to kind of take the time, make the effort to unravel that. Okay, I've looked at, I think I've used this example with you guys of like histories of witchcraft from the Middle Ages, where they put a pair of pants on trial, like these pants are damned, and so that, there's like or you have people with basically doctoral degrees saying, well, they could fly on a broomstick, but you can only have 3 witches on a broomstick. They've got like the physics of this like worked out, like they're incredibly smart and rational, but like their perspective on the universe, because of what they knew at any given time, was so different than ours that they're coming to stuff we're like, wait, what? But then if you unpack it, you realize, oh, that's why this made sense to them. And if you don't do it and you read it, then you think, well, this person's crazy, or this person's, you come to completely, if that's called presentism, right? That's the risk of, that you judge people, often without knowing it, by 21st century, standards or parameters, when you realize, oh, they were talking about or thinking about something totally different.
Yeah, and I do think, like, because in how the newsroom works at HPR, which I'm not in the newsroom, but it's a small station, and we all know what's going on. But you're right, like, taking X number of time, airtime, space, to just retell a story is not deemed newsworthy. That's not something that the editors are gonna say, okay, yeah,
Right.
you can do this, and I think one thing to keep in mind is for these papers, there's already talk about what they're losing. So if we write this and it's somewhere and people are reading it, we won't lose it. And at the end of the year, you could actually you save all of your, they're also like huge. They're very long, they're like huge. It takes a big table to lay them out. And you could save all of your issues for the year, take it back to the press, and they will bind it for you. So you can have your year bound and then given back to you.
Oh, they really treasured these.
Yeah, so they were big, and what would happen is, like, maybe somebody would have a subscription, and you would just hand it out. I mean, when you're done reading, give it to the next person and they could read through it. And yeah, and it is, I always have to remember that news for them was not as lightning fast as it is today. So they're, by the time the paper makes its rounds.
And I wonder, I'd have to like look at this rather than just coming to this conclusion, but was the definitions and understandings of news in, mid-19th century mainland America, comparable to what it is to us? And were they aware of that when they were publishing something that was so different? That like, wow, this isn't really news, but we're doing this for a specific reason. Or was there not that shared understanding in the first place? Like, that's not clear to me.
I think, yes, the shared understanding is that they do have their news, they have their daily news, they have literally local and national, like outside of Hawaii news, and then they have the stories. And I think also because there's no TV,
Right.
So that is the recreational activity,
Right.
in a sense, but also there's heavy connotations in the stories. One is to preserve the story, whose version of the story it is. And there are some interesting, depending on the author, like Kamakaua writes about Kamehameha's birth. And if you read it in the way that he wrote it, and you compare it to the birth of Alexander the Great, it is weirdly similar. Can I say that he like used the same thing? No. And I've heard, we've all heard sort of the same tellings that it's similar. So could it be a universal coincidence? Yes. Could it also be that maybe was he reading Alexander? He'd already read Alexander the Great when he was in school. Like the lightning and the storms and the everything almost lines up line for line. So in a way, it becomes this educational device for those who have gone to school and they're scholars to sort of try to also educate their people in all these various sub-levels. Like they're getting the story, but somebody, a farmer in Ka'u probably didn't go to school, probably didn't read Alexander the Great, but read a story about his own people in a very oddly similar fashion.
Yeah.
Kamakaua also changes some, he talks about the creation of Hawaiians and he uses the trilogy. So it's fascinating, but people do kind of understand, they read it, and they often protest when he writes anyway. Like they write in and they say, you're wrong. Those are my favorites. My favorites are the back and forth. They get really ugly. They're very insulting. My second favorite are like the legal announcements that we still do today. Like, I'm leaving my wife, don't lend her money. She no longer has any ties to me. And the wife is like, I'm leaving him because he beats me. Please do not, think that I am a wanton woman. So it's all packaged together. And it's almost just like your daily life. Like this is.
Yeah. And those letters to the editor, are invaluable when you're looking, into the past because, there was no comment section in the, like, on the internet now. And so if you want to know, like, if we're talking about this whole top down and is it a company and does the newspaper reflect the people? When those letters of the editor are so, especially as you get into the 20th century, so invaluable. And the ads, like you said, and the classified, of just giving you these little peeks into, or fan magazines, that you get. I mean, you're always looking for this bottom up to challenge the overwhelming top down stuff that you're getting from media history, right?
And wasn't it also a way for people on different islands to communicate?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
you'd have like a reporter on each island, or people would just send in what happened, and the editor would choose and compile. So sometimes you get people like, I sent you this, and I know you chose, and they'll literally, I know it's just sitting on the floor.
Right, you're not publishing this.
Yeah,
Yes.
so it is, yeah, so it's a way, inter-island communication. Some very small papers are like obviously church run, so for their parishioners. So yeah, there's so many, it was like a multi-purpose thing, you had news, you had stories, it was like the TV of the time,
And you had a lot, I mean, a lot of,
Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, it's all of them.
or Kinko's, frankly. Like a lot of these are like, you go back to colonial papers, and I'm sure this was going on there, is the paper is basically the printing office. And people come in and they give stuff to the printer. And then people get pissed off about what's in the paper, and the printer says, hey, I just print what people give me. Oh, well, now we have the birth of objective journalism, right? Or Mark Zuckerberg saying, oh, I don't censor, I just put it on Facebook. And then everybody's like, well, why don't you exercise some discretion here, buddy? It's interesting to see how this evolves. I bet a number of these are a little bit like your local coffee shop that prints it, prints what they get. And so it is purely a reflection of what the people are coming in and submitting.
I think there's also like a clear understanding that it's up to the editor to choose what goes there. And you could pay for space later on, but the way that they write their letters to the editor are, today I think we look at it like I'm writing to the editor because I'm a member of the community. I'm not asking for space. I'm writing because I think you should, because objectively you should give all sides. They write these very humble, almost borderline begging, like really like pleasing things to the editor. Like, dear editor, please, if you have space in your robust newspaper body, they really personify the paper. The paper becomes a person. And it's like in your literal body, if you can have space for me in your heart over here, please, print what I have to say. Which we obviously don't see today,
Sharp contrast from New Orleans newspaper history, where the editors of the mascot, 3 of them were shot dead at the desk in the 1880s for publishing articles against people. Literally shot dead at the
Oh,
desk.
I mean, every editor of a San Francisco paper from the gold rush into the 1870s got shot dead in the muddy streets.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it was incredibly violent. People didn't, like the way we do in modern times, necessarily make a distinction between you insulting me in the pages of the paper and like you punching somebody. It was like they get insulted in the paper, they go out and shoot the guy the next day. And it happened all the time. Like the history of 19th century papers is incredibly violent.
And when it goes through that editorial process too, I think there are certain changes that the write-ups or things they go through, because it's according to their own perspective, right? That they're publishing your contributions or someone else's contributions.
Yeah, but I would still say, the editorial process is very different from today. And surprisingly, sometimes they do print things that are very slanderous to their own paper. So whatever process that they're using to decide what to put in there, it is kind of fascinating. I don't know if anybody could really pull it out unless they found somebody's diary somewhere. But the way that they pick and choose what, and then, I don't know that space is an issue for some of them. Sometimes they have, some issues are like 8 pages long. So sometimes they don't have space. People also write and implore to the children who set the type. There's always a little message sometimes of thank you. To like literally the kids who drove the type script.
Right.
And
It's
in a
like
way,
a
it's
huge
like-
amount of work.
It is, and that's why children have to do, because their hands are so little.
Oh, wow.
To fit all of the tiny little type script, but they would say like, oh, please give my love to the children who, but also it's a way of saying thank you for printing it correctly. Because, every once in a while you get something upside down, but it was very much like, thank you for also setting everything correctly for me.
Right.
Because also the children kind of have their own ability to mess it up for you. Which tells you also that the children are probably able to read it
Yeah,
while they're studying.
huh. So, anyway, what time do we have? Okay, so, I do, let's see, we've been doing, or I've certainly have been doing a lot of talking. You guys have more thoughts that come along with this before we move on to, I'm thinking we should then do, you guys should give us an update on your proposals, and then we'll do the 30 minutes or 30 to 40 on the map, right? So, you guys have, it's been a lot of stuff, a lot of incoming today. You guys have,
Yeah, I'm just absorbing, and it's a lot of really interesting knowledge and information which is quite new to me, in terms of the whole Hawaiian language and history, and the way he just really punched it up. It was really. I actually have a question for you, Paige, if I may. You mentioned about how some of the translations were misused. Can you give me an example? Give us an example of how they were misused and why indigenous Hawaiians are skeptical about other people translating their work?
So I think maybe the most obvious way that things can be even just mistranslations sometimes really offends people. Back then and today, even just the interpretation of genealogy, getting that wrong really offends people, because if that's their family, they don't like that. They don't even like that printed, period. The most obvious way, so there's two sort of separate or multiple separate schools of translation. So there's this literary things, stories. I was doing science related things, which I'm not a scientist. So when I translate, it comes out the English that I taught, and maybe not in the science language that they use. The next biggest issue is with land documents. So the unique thing about Hawaii is you can take any parcel of land and trace it all the way back to the original, to the mahele. You can tell who actually received that parcel of land in the first land division. But what happens is when you translate legal and land documents, it again is a whole nother set of language. It's another Hawaiian. In the same way that I would have difficulty reading legal documents. So when you translate and any kind of title issue that happens, like you'll see like title guarantee, that's what they do, titles and land, quieting land deeds. They have to pull the original. They have to walk it back. But sometimes the people who are pulling those don't speak Hawaiian either. And when you work with a land document, there are very subtle things in the language, but if you translate that wrong, you could be saying, oh, and then he gave it to this person. Instead of what really happened is he received it from that person. So there are various different examples from history, but land gets really, really tenuous. But even sometimes in saying, I think currently, Mauna Kea, what constitutes it as sacred. And so pulling things about Mauna Kea and how we view it can also get misconstrued you know, I've seen people say, well, there was nothing about it between here and here. There are just so many different things in everyday life that by translating it incorrectly or through just a biased lens can impact people today. So those kinds of things happen often, you know.
Any other thoughts, or are there ways that you guys are connecting this to either digital storytelling, you guys are thinking are worth sharing at this point, or to what you're doing, or what we've read?
I don't have an exact question, but we were talking about like, this tension that was happening because he's not amazing Hawaiian, and that he is so prominent in the field, and I guess, like, the three of us are working on projects right now, and we are trying to incorporate some of these translations that we find and some maybe archives into the project, but I guess, like, what is our place in doing that? Like, how are we going to confirm how we're going about it? Is it correct or not? And we were talking about ideas as communication researchers, like how we can move forward if we wanted to do something like this, but again, like, who are we? Like, I guess it's just a struggle that I'm having. It's not really a question, but like, how would you say we should approach it?
I think the best way to do it is always to be transparent about what your goal is in anything. I think we're in a very nice pivotal shift in social consciousness today, to where, and sometimes like I don't like people who don't like me. You know, like I don't like that comment. I like to not read the comments
Like
on
that,
anything
yeah.
these days. But I think, you know, people will always have their opinions. And they will always question unless you're upfront about what you're doing, why you're doing it. Denby Fawcett wrote something that pissed me off the other day. You know, she said something, well, there's no story about Pele Kaena, so da 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 da. But you can't read it. So she drew a conclusion from what she knows, because there's a history she can't access. But the way she wrote it was very dismissive of it being there. You know, so I think it really depends on your approach, being transparent about what you're doing, where you're doing it, and like and what the goal is. You can choose to take a stance as a community member, as a resident. You know, it really ties into how you're going to define your connection to the subject.
You know, I think the thing about higher education is it's incredibly humbling, because the more, like, by the time you get to the doctoral level, you're like, I know nothing about anything. I mean, you know, Joseph was getting frustrated with me yesterday because we're trying to wrap up this like chapter we're writing about digitization, and like we're running out of time, and I'm like, did we ever really do a complete search of the subject that we're writing about? And as soon as like I went back to Google Scholar and started to, you know, it's like I'm pulling up like fundamental stuff that we missed. And it's just like, so you have to realize like it's the process of scholarship is iterative. You're gonna sometimes, especially when you're talking about history, when you draft a history of something, you're just gonna get it wrong. Because it's gonna be based on incomplete information, and the truth may be, and that's what's terrifying in a way about it, but it's also what's fascinating. It's sort of like, I don't know, I compare it to like, if I get a big bowl of buffalo wings and I start eating them too fast, my lips swell up, and I start eating the buffalo wings faster, and I get like addicted, and it's like, you know, it's terrifying, but it's also like, I want more buffalo wings. It's like when you write history, you write something, you've done all this work, and then you realize, oh, I was missing this one fragment, and because I discovered this, the entire thing that I wrote is upside down. It's opposite. And the idea that you're doing it because you're some colonialist, you know, I think is like where it's like, wait a minute, you know, I may not know everything, and I may be learning as I produce knowledge, and that's a loaded term in colonialism, right? The production of knowledge, production of maps. That was so much part of the imperial project. But you know, you are producing knowledge, you're disseminating knowledge, and you're gonna make mistakes. And the way to deal with that is to be in dialogue about it, not to condemn someone for getting something wrong or for missing a perspective. You know? Yeah.
I just want to share something that I came across, and I was looking into some old newspapers, and there was a newspaper from 1917. It was an English language newspaper in Hawaii. What's the name? Pull it up. So that the newspaper was about how there was an event, and they were celebrating an event in Waikiki, and it had to do with water sports, and one of the water sports included turtle catching. But I couldn't find any historical records of turtle catching being a water sport or a traditional water sport here. And it had to do with, because I was searching about Waikiki and Duke, the surfer. And so he was the one who actually inaugurated that particular event. And they mentioned surfing and other water sports, and then they specifically mentioned that they were going to give a prize to the person who, there were these top swimmers, and they were supposed to catch a turtle, and they mentioned it as a traditional sport. But when I looked it up, I couldn't find anything. I just thought I was just putting it out there, I mean, is this something that was made up by the white man, whoever was writing at that time? And he just made it up?
I think it was fun. You have to remember that turtles were much more plentiful and not illegal to touch. That's very recent in the annals of history. My grand uncle was a fisherman, and he used to catch turtles and tie them up to the coconut tree and spray them with the water hose until he's ready to take them to market. Somewhere in the 60s, there's an article somewhere that I've been trying to find. He caught so many turtles that his boat sank, and they had to be rescued, and it was really embarrassing for my grand aunt. She was like extremely embarrassed, but it's in the newspaper. So I think in that time, it was probably like, yeah, why not? Why don't you go and
Well,
swim?
they're not very fast.
Grab
I mean,
one.
that doesn't seem like much of a sport, like turtle catching.
It depends, and it can be, and it depends on how big they are, and, but also if they are big, you also have to swim the back end. And they're huge. I mean, now because they've been protected, they grow to like an enormous size. And so I don't think it's like a very storied sport, but we have stories of people riding sharks, just hitching a ride, using them to tow you out. If you're gonna. So they're just, I think they're things that people do for fun that never make it to the Olympics.
So I was just wondering, maybe in these newspapers, in these Hawaiian newspapers, we might find something related to turtle catching as a sport, as one of the sports, like which included surfing as well. Surfing was Hawaiian sport, but maybe turtle catching was one of those sports too. But
I haven't
couldn't
seen
find
it
any reference.
yet, but I've read some very dynamic accounts of how people surf. One of the ways that people know as an expert surfer is somebody who doesn't get wet. The best surfer is the one who doesn't get wet.
So one of my big questions, we have to go to maps, so I'll just put this on the table without, I don't think we have time to talk about it. One of my big questions, and Joseph and I were talking about this, is especially for digital storytelling, Puakea was telling us that the presence of, visual stuff, like by the 1880s, 1890s, you had huge leaps forward in printing where you could do colorful printing and line illustration, and pretty soon you could print photographs, and that developed. And that is obviously really important to digital storytelling, right? And also to other things. Like if you want to, for example, get funding to scan all the originals. So if you notice, he was saying they scanned all these microfilms, but they haven't scanned the originals. Like that's a whole, they're starting all over in a way. We're trying to do that. How do you fund it? One of the things he's doing in New Orleans is he's capitalizing on the visual element of all this stuff to, because the tourists like Hawaii, there's a huge tourism thing in Louisiana that can bring all that in, and so one of the things we've wondered is, like Puakea was saying, well, they would even complain that the illustrations would take up too much space and take space away from the text, that they were just not, the newspapers weren't that interested in visual images. But was there an outlet in publishing during the 19th, early 20th century for all the visual images?
Yeah, well, yes, so after a certain period, there's lots of pictures. I was working on an article about an eruption, and Joseph W. who's writing, wrote, oh, you can see in the picture I attached that I sent with this letter. Well, there was no picture in the newspaper. They didn't publish the picture he sent, but I think it was, again, kind of up to the editor on what they wanted to, but there are, in the very early first newspapers, they were really primers, they were educational primers. And so each edition had, I think it's a lithograph of an animal, because they were talking about the animal. So how do you teach people in Hawaii who've never seen an elephant before what an elephant looks like? So I think it was a preference as to how important the picture was. But there are portraits of people. I was just looking up things for my family, and I found a picture of my great grandpa's step great grandpa.
Wow.
His wife, his first wife had died, so he wrote essentially a very long, beautiful obituary. There's lots of those. And it's something they did prioritize is when someone passed away, is writing like a dirge for them. They would publish those. So there's a portrait of her in there. She's not my grandmother. He married her after, but he did name his last child after his first wife. And it's my auntie. They know I knew it later.
So was there a boom period when there was, like, by the 1890s, early 20th century?
Yeah, there's definitely more prevalent, especially with natural disasters. If there was a picture, of sort of the wreckage, sometimes I'll find a lot of stuff about tsunamis. There might be a picture with it. So it does happen more often. Probably not as prevalent as today's media. It's almost always a visual to accompany any feature story. But I think for some reason for people, the actual description in text was more important than the picture.
Interesting.
Because the Hawaiian can be enough to give you a very clear picture of what's happening. Yeah. So, but there are quite a few, like you dig around in Puakea and you can put in a search term and just click pictures. So that you can just look at the pictures that were associated.
Cool. All right, well, we're getting it, it's a little bit late, but you guys want to do the mapping thing?
Sure, just me,
Okay,
just me, yeah.
well, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
What?
Keep breaking.
Oh, yeah, you can,
Yeah.
let's take a break.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paige.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Your insights are very valuable.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course.
Yeah, no, thanks, Cindy. Usually Puakea does these things.
My flight's overbooked, so I just got on the list for a voucher for travel.
Oh, really? So you
Yeah,
missed
but-
it? You
Yeah,
possibly
but I
missed
still
it?
have to go. I
What?
still have to go.
Yeah.
They don't tell you until you get to the gate.
Okay, do you want me to wait for you?
No, what do you mean? No, because strangely enough, this is how it works. They gave me a second flight, like, oh, your flight's overbooked. We need volunteers to take a flight at 10:30 p.m.
Oh, okay.
But guess what?
What?
It gets me there sooner.
Oh, wow.
And I might get $600.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, it says how much money. You have to choose the lowest one, because if you choose the highest one, it'll give it to you.
Wow. Well, I just hope they don't put you in a middle row or, whatever. Make sure they give you a window seat.
Okay, yeah, sure.
So,
I put the presentation in our shared Google folder.
It's weird. I don't know how How are you guys doing on Zoom?
They're doing.
Yeah. they're
Doing good, just hanging in there. Good.
No.
Just trying to make sure I can. I'm listening in, but at the same time too, trying to make sure I take care of my baby girl here at the same time. I do apologize, doctor. But that was really fascinating hearing about the Hawaiian newspapers. That was really interesting.
Good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Yeah, I mean, I thought you guys would be into that.
Story maps. Yeah, there it is.
You want to, should we download it? You want to do it
I can just do
natively?
it-
or-
I can just do it right there.
Okay.
As long as, you know, if, when you go through, if you can, just click on links.
Because it's very crucial, this presentation.
You should be able to,
Okay.
especially because it's in the browser this
Yeah,
way.
okay.
I mean, where's the full screen this way?
Makes sense out of all the things
Maybe
on there.
slideshow.
Yeah. So yeah, Joseph, I don't know that I budgeted time for both of you guys to do much on the mapping presentation. but we'll
I
see.
can do mine next time. He's not gonna be here next time, so I'm absolutely happy to do it next time. That might make more sense.
Let's see, I don't know who's. Next week?
Yeah, so we can do it on, so we
Okay,
can just
that
share
seems
it
like
on the
that
same
could be-
day.
Yeah,
Mhm.
there was some stuff that my friend, you know, and I could put you in touch with Scott Schimmel, who, there's like, you know, what he kept going back to.
I've always told stories, just never done stuff quite like this.
Now we got. Speakers working.
No doubt.
Puakea's entire thing, we couldn't
Was-
get the damn
couldn't even
thing.
hear.
Yeah, but YouTube, you know, of course, the advertising, yeah. So, but anyway, so every time, so the person who invented this class is Scott Schimmel. And every time I would say, Scott, what do I have to do to get this class together? He would talk to me about this like Ken Burns effect, and then there's this newer thing called the parallax or something. You know, he likes to geek out on technical, you know, cool, like, you know, the kind of things that documentary filmmakers geek out on. And yeah, and so, and it has to do with the fact that, you know, as people like, you know who Ken Burns is? As people like Ken Burns make documentary films, they're not going out and doing a lot of interviewing and stuff like that. They're pulling a lot of archival stuff. So what they're doing is they're using effects like this Ken Burns effect, where they're making the background move while the person in the foreground is. Do you know anything about how to do any of that?
I don't know how to do it, but it could be tried. It's not that hard.
You know how to do that? Oh, awesome. Okay. So, because that'll be an education for me. So I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, I don't even. I'm sure I've seen it a million times, but it sounds cheesy when I imagine it. But you know, like the background is gonna move, but foreground. It is really cool.
Yeah, it's, well, I wasn't gonna focus on like animating photos, it was more on creating voice story filming, but I can.
Yeah, I think that I think he kept bringing it up over and over because he was sort of suggesting, hey, if you're gonna teach them digital storytelling, like this is a really valuable and important skill to learn. You know, I think that's right. Yeah, I was being a little thick-headed about it because I was like, oh yeah, like one more thing I need to learn about this. Like, at the time, I didn't even know Night Lab and story maps and stuff, so I was feeling a little overwhelmed. But
So I should plan for still the next.
Yeah, and I think, and you know, one of the things I should probably try and do, we're still, it's kind of a good thing we're not even into April yet, because I think we could do a field trip or two.
Oh,
And
yeah.
possibly, you know, either ask Puakea if he would come back for a full thing, or do, if you guys want to go deeper. I mean, I think we could do something possibly with other Hawaiian sources, like either at the Bishop Museum or, I mean, it's a trek, but out at West Oahu to Uluru for their video archive, if that's worth going to in person.
There's the state archives too, but they, I think they only allow a certain people in at one time.
Well, so there's the state archives, we were just talking about this with Puakea, there's the state archives and there's Bishop. And he was sort of suggesting, what was
He said his whole thing was, state archives, but he actually recommended that they might be better with a class.
So there's
And
more
that,
of
and
it.
that, yeah, because we said, oh, there's two, he said, there's two places. And you said, oh, would you go here or there? And he goes, well, the state archives might be more tuned to having a whole class in it.
Because there'd be more people to help out.
Yeah, that's true.
But then the other archive would be, yeah.
I feel like
With
one thing
COVID,
that,
it's tough at Bishop.
yeah, I feel like one thing that would be really valuable for you guys, like when I was in a doctoral class, of course, it was a summer school thing at Harvard, and we walked across the, you know, like basically across a hallway, essentially, from one building to the building next to it. And what the professor said was, everybody find an artifact and just spend, you know, the rest of class looking at it, and then we'll talk about it or whatever. And I found, you know, it was a special edition of the Harvard Crimson. This is at Harvard, where, you know, during like '68, when all the students took over all the buildings around the country, like Columbia and universities all over, they did sit-ins, they took over the administration, shut it down, part of this like revolution, new left, Vietnam War, everything kind of protest thing. And they took over, the students took over the Harvard administration. The students went through all of the administrative files and published a special issue about all the relationships that Harvard had with the military industrial complex of the Boston area, with like maps of like their connections with Raytheon and all of the, you know, like charts and maps of all the relationships with intelligence and military. And it was, you know, it was pretty crazy as like a special issue, like a book, but like a special issue of the Harvard Crimson or Harvard Crimson publication. You know, so it's like, it would be cool to have you guys all look at, you know, somewhere where you can find really cool artifacts and you guys.
Yeah, because right now we're just looking at screens. I would actually like to know where this stuff is, you know?
Yeah, and like what's the difference? What do you get out of doing that? And, you know, just for its own sake, and also, you know, then there's something about like, well, what if we digitize things? You know?
Hopefully everyone has just been to the Bishop Museum anyway, you know, artifacts.
I mean, you know, I've been there like for an exhibit or two. I haven't spent that much time there, but I mean, I just went to the surfing one when they had that big exhibit up. But I mean, I think being able to go in and have the people that go into there, I mean,
Yeah,
I don't know that I've ever been to a museum and had them be like, hey, come into the back.
yeah,
And like, here's where we keep all our cool shit. Like, just like, you know, let's pull this out. Yeah.
Yeah.
You gotta know people, you gotta be a professor saying, hey, can my class come in? And,
Yeah.
you know, but I need to plan it, so I guess, you know, Puakea, like I was saying, Puakea was sort of saying, you're gonna get more, probably more staff helping you out if you go to the state archives versus the Bishop. I could call each and feel it out, and if you guys don't mind, I may need to just pull the trigger when we talk to them about it.
yeah, the Bishop Museum just takes longer to get what you're interested in, because you you look through the descriptions and then you give them a index card that has the number on it, and then you hand it to them and they print you out like a photos and things like that. So it's a little bit of time back and forth.
There's not a similar system like that at the state archive?
At the state archives, it's a little bit easier. You can, you don't have to give them as detailed information on what you're looking for.
Mhm.
You can just browse yourself a little bit easier.
Interesting,
And these
okay.
are more like, physical images.
Is there a big difference in the quality of the artifacts in one versus the other?
No,
No? So state archive would be better.
it would take less time, I think.
Yeah.
And like I said, the last time I checked on the Michigan Museum website, they were, because of COVID, they still weren't really allowing a lot of people physically in to look at the archives.
Well, what about, I could try and call, I don't know that it makes sense to go to West Oahu and do the moving image stuff.
Okay, I don't know what.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's probably thinking it's 20.
Yeah, they're coming back or what? Okay.
It's just him.
Fabian?
Yeah.
Is that the only person we're missing? right now?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, well,
Want me to sit over there?
well, so let's see, should we do, Joseph, you want to do yours and then?
Yeah.
You
I
think
mean,
that
you're
makes
set
sense?
up.
No, but you're leaving, so we're happy to share next week. That's no problem at all.
All right.
Well,
He's like, I know.
no, my computer reset and literally all my tabs, I have to reopen like 150 tabs.
I had the same thing happen. My Chrome, my browser crashed. I've been having technical hassles with stuff here all day. So,
Wait, how do I, okay, so do I have to use my own computer? Do I use?
do you want to
You
do
can
it?
connect it with HDMI if you want.
With, I don't have an HDMI, this thing's old. Maybe not.
What do you have as an input? Do you have a RCA plug? I mean, do you have a?
Mine's too old, mine's just too old.
Let me see.
Yeah, no, mine's too old, mine's fire.
Let me see if I have an old one.
Mine's,
Well, I got this,
that's it.
and there should be an RCA plug sticking out of that desk,
Right here.
or VCA, I think those are called.
I guess,
I mean, you can't be the mountain because
okay,
it's a long.
yeah.
In the sense that it's gonna take a year.
Let me see here. Oh, man, all right, well, I don't even have anything up here,
So,
because I didn't know it was going next.
yeah, all right,
You guys
so,
put me on the spot, now I don't, now I don't.
well, you could, if you feel like coming back on Zoom and showing us some of your stuff,
No, I just have to look it all up now.
you want to do it, or?
Yeah, I just have to, I didn't, you literally put me on the spot, so I didn't know.
Wait, so did you get these? Oh, where I work, you produce these.
Oh.
It's right here. I know, I noticed Paige here. I was like, what's
So
that?
which office are you with?
Sea Grant. Sea Grant, it's over in the HIV building. Oh, Dr. Nick. So this is the very first one. Oh, you do, really? Yeah. Very first one you did was twice a year. Dr. G. Oh, there it is.
Yeah, well, you guys can submit with your annotated bibliography.
Yeah, because there's one thing before, it's between some of the end of the proposal and then the presentation. That's on the
Well, I can't remember what I said. I mean, I think the idea originally was, this was, you know, when I thought you guys would just pitch in March, and that would be, I think at this point, you guys, I mean, do you want to do a formal presentation? I don't feel like.
No, I think just written.
Oh, yeah, I'm just
I mean, I think what we should do is.
I didn't know I was
Take your time, if you guys want to do a full one, that's fine, but I mean, as far as the grade, I think I'd probably grade the written one.
Okay, so like casual checking.
Yeah, I mean, if you guys think it would be helpful or interesting to throw up some visual aids and stuff, that's great. But you shouldn't feel like, oh, I'm gonna grade you on this. You know, I'll grade your written proposal. Just to distinguish it from what you guys have.
That's the professor, working with the contact. She teaches on Filipinos.
Here?
Yeah.
Oh, good. So is that really helping out?
Yeah, at the history department. Yeah, so contact.
So does it turn out, did you learn stuff about this guy? Is he fruitful of subject? Is she, yeah?
Yeah, so I got a Zoom meeting with her on Thursday. So I'll write an outline of what we discussed.
Okay. Do you know if do we know yet if he's sort of a folk hero or not?
It's not leaning towards that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not leaning towards that. Okay, so we'll see.
Right.
No, and I think I speak with her. I share with her. Thank you.
Okay, let's see if I can find this. All right. A few things I want to show you. I just want to start by showing you this, and hopefully somebody will get back to me here and I can find another link. All right. So so I'm working on a project. We just got a little grant funding to, we don't even really know what we're doing, to be honest with you. What we're doing is, I have 700,000, the Hawaiian language newspapers write are 125,000 pages. Well, I own 700,000 pages of newspapers. Okay. So it's a lot, all right? It's 42 years of history, but the daily in New Orleans was like 72 pages, okay? It started 16 and then it ended up by 1929, it ended up, So one of the things that we're doing is we're just looking at like oil and gas history. Basically, it's a big thing in Louisiana, okay? It's like Louisiana's, the number one, oil and gas industry in the country, but we're the 49th poorest state. Which that doesn't make any sense, right? Doesn't really make any sense. So what we're doing is I'm working with the New Orleans Center for the Gulf South at Tulane University. Okay, I'm at LSU, but I got a grant from them, basically just to do research. I'm just getting research assistance. And what we're doing is it's like we don't know what we're going to find, but what we're looking for, the reason we're doing this is because when you start scratching the surface and asking around and start looking for oil and gas history, there's nothing. And I mean, there's books, there's secondary sources, right? But there's not like there's a big compendium of Shell Oil publishing their maps of dredging the Louisiana bayous, right? That's not available. It's in the newspapers, okay? So what we're doing is research assistants are going to be looking through specific time periods, okay? All this corresponds with two things. The oil and gas industry corresponds with automobile industry and aviation industry. Those are the two industries that are the driving force for oil and gas, okay? So it's all in the 1900s through 1920s, basically is what we're looking at. While I pulled this geocartographer on in my project, because he's very, very advanced in understanding how to do these very cool things with maps. So he's developed, what he did is he's located in the Library of Congress. So the reason I'm talking about this and presenting this to you is because there's ways to go into the Library of Congress's maps archives, okay? Which they're very extensive, okay? At some point in time, they did these fire insurance maps, okay? So I'll just give you an example of one like from New Orleans, okay? And he basically, this is all of Louisiana. Every parish, we have parishes in Louisiana and not counties, okay? So this is all the parishes in Louisiana. Now, what he does is he has everything from the Library of Congress loaded. It's already loaded into his system. It's already there, kind of quietly hiding. He downloaded it all, then re-uploaded it all. Or he does direct links directly to the Library of Congress's images. And what he does is he takes these images and he overlays them on top of current maps, okay? And the way he does it is he basically has developed this whole thing. There's many ways to do this, okay? But for research purposes, he's developed this because there's an intense amount of potential here with mapping. So he's basically has this whole system set up so that you can go in and you can, oh, am I not logged in? Maybe I have to log in. Where he basically corresponds these maps from the Library of Congress. Here, I'll show you an example of his example. And he takes his maps from the Library of Congress. Okay, so if you all don't know this, you can go and search Hawaii. There's hundreds of Hawaii maps in the Library of Congress's collection. Okay. Here's mine. It's popping up here. This is I'm just showing the sample project that he did, but I don't have any internet. So it's connected.
Yeah, I've had slow internet. You guys had slow internet?
Yesterday, yes.
There you
I know, I'm getting there.
Man, I don't understand why this isn't loading. I'm sorry. Feel ill prepared, y'all.
Working for 6 years.
It's really overrated. I'm not sure how it's overrated.
Well, my links are not loading, so I have no idea what's up with the internet right now. Oh man, he has this behind some sort of sign off. I don't know why this isn't loading.
Well, part of this, you guys, is what he's talking about, the oil and gas map. And Cindy would appreciate this. Very particular. I was an environmental reporter in Louisiana and in South Florida for years. And all the oil and gas companies chopped up all of South Louisiana with canals, like to move their ships and their boats in and out to access their drilling platforms. And their canals ran east-west. Well, the water that would carry the silt and kind of cover all of South Louisiana with land, all the water runs from the north down to the south. So they minced up. It's like somebody went in there with like a chopping, like with a machete and chopped up all South Louisiana. So come climate change, sea level rise, you're starting to have like whole huge more and more chunks of South Louisiana just dropping into the ocean. So South Louisiana is disappearing. They talk about the tattered boot of South Louisiana, how it's sort of shaped like all of Louisiana is shaped like a boot, and the bottom part of the boot is tattered with the Channel Islands and all that. That's all, dropping into the water, like disappearing. And so what he's doing has like a real, the idea of mapping with all the oil and gas maps and everything, all of South Louisiana, has a really politically powerful and environmentally important like purpose for that.
So- So his thing, which I don't understand, I have to be honest, I was on the phone for an hour and a half yesterday to do a tutorial with him to show me how to show you guys this. And it's not working, but basically what he does, okay? And this is really important for like, if you're gonna develop any multimedia type thing, okay? If you go to the Library of Congress's maps, right? When you go all the way down at the bottom, there should be a triple IM number when you click on the map source. And that number, you basically can take that number, and I'm not seeing it here. Let's see, right? Cite this item, rights and access. Where there's a way for you to basically see this number, and then you can import the map in the background. And then when you take like your historic map, match with your modern map, use 3 points of connection. So like for an intersection, and I was gonna try to, I apologize, I feel really embarrassed, like seriously, because this isn't
Sorry,
loading.
just
This isn't loading. But basically what he does, and I can, you know, we can give you a tutorial another day, maybe Adam and I can come back on. But basically what he's done is you take a street map, right? That just shows a little tiny part of the neighborhood, because like the fire insurance maps, it's 175 pages of the whole city of New Orleans, and they break it down to little quadrants, okay? Where it's just 4 blocks this way, 3 blocks this way. Now what you do is you actually pull the map, like he's brought him into the system where he can pull a street map, and then you can actually tether it to the exact points on the map. It's the super easiest way to do this. And then you export it, and then you can bring that map layer into your digital humanities project. So with something like the Hawaiian map, you know, if you wanted to take like this is a huge map. This is a massive detailed scan. But like, just say you were doing, you know, a comparative analysis of a bunch of different maps, okay? You would basically, you know, you could drop a pin on one little point of the map on one end of the island, one little point of the map on the other end of the island, a third point on another end. And then those points match up to a modern Google map, okay? Have you guys ever done anything like this yet? Okay. Well, this is I'm gonna get the web address for that one, but this one is one that he designed just for Louisiana. But I asked him, I said, hey, how easy would this be to do Hawaii? And he said, oh, it would be very easy to do Hawaii, but there could be a whole website, like he's dedicated his website just to Louisiana. But there could be a whole website. He could mirror his website and bring in hundreds of Hawaiian maps as well.
I wonder if you could, but I mean, couldn't you do this with just static with juxtapose? Remember the juxtapose?
No, it does not work. This is a geocartographer doing it using GIS. This is like a very specific way that you do it so that when you're using the Google map base, it's still tethered. The old maps are still tethered to the new map. And it also has all sorts of functions like transparency and things like that. So you can have like both maps together, you know what I mean? And you can scroll over it and show different things.
So the French Quarter, you can see where all the gambling dens and brothels are, and how now there's the new gambling dens and new brothels.
Basically, you know. This one should load, and I don't know why it's loading, and I wanted to show you this example of specifically how he did it with these really particular neighborhoods in Alexandria, because if his maps were loading, you could see he did like 17 different maps on top of it. I don't understand why they're not loading, honestly.
I guess you have to sign in.
No. This one is he already created an engagement. So he already created an engagement. So he already did a little he already did like a little cool example for everyone to see, but I don't know why it's not loading. But the gist of it, let me see if I can go to Alexandria and see. No, because it's just showing how many maps he has of that area. So like, for example,
You're thinking of Alexandria, Virginia?
New Orleans?
Yeah, but it's another one.
Yeah, this is Alexandria, Louisiana.
Yeah, that's what it's,
For example, like,
Very
you
different.
know, if you look at New Orleans, there's literally like over 1,000 maps. It's well over 1,000 maps of just from 1885 to 1951. And that's just the fire insurance maps. These are not, this is just one type of map. It's not like a bunch of types of maps. It's not like a road atlas. It's not that, it's like just the fire insurance maps. And the reason the fire insurance maps are so interesting is, here, I'll just bring one up and I'll show you the value of the internet's slow. Sorry.
Did any of these maps get lost in the Katrina?
No, because they're housed at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., not New Orleans.
Good.
Yeah, this is the Library of Congress's collection that he's using.
So Cindy, I forgot to tell you that I did finally belatedly, see, I had been in touch with someone from the geography department about ArcGIS, and she runs ArcGIS workshops. She had not gotten back to me.
I don't know what it's doing.
We got carried on.
It's a really damn good question. Why none of
Carried
it's
away
loading
with
on
the
this.
semester and everything.
Because this should be
Over
loaded.
break, I did reach out to her. She got back to me this morning and wanted to do a like a Zoom session with me tomorrow morning. I was thinking, well, it'll be too late for the math thing, but since we're, yeah, right. And I mean, she was saying, oh, I run this for kids, showing them how to use ArcGIS, and she was like, story mapping is really cool. I mean, the one thing that I need you guys to fill in, I was really reassured or encouraged that you actually know ArcGIS, because I'm confused. Like, that seems like very sophisticated software, whereas the story mapping stuff is very simple.
I don't know our GIS.
It says it's like fully connected. I mean, it says it's connected to you.
I would just say, but you only like doing some of the examples I saw. And we wanted to use.
I mean, we could try. I
wanna
bet
use it
you
for
UH
what?
is
They
fine.
have pretty good like the story
Yeah,
mapping.
yeah.
So Katie may be helpful in terms of pointing us to, you know, showing us what's involved.
That's how class just falls apart. Sorry.
What the advantages would be of that versus something like
If this is, yeah, I mean, if anyone's doing mapping, who's doing mapping? Are you guys doing mapping?
Presentation due this week?
What?
Do we have a presentation due this week?
You have a written presentation due Thursday.
Is it?
Very good question, guys.
Well, not a presentation, but a written proposal.
I told you.
Just all spinning.
And the explanation for what the components of that should be are up there.
Is
I
it
just copied and
5
pasted
pages
some syllabus.
each person?
No,
From the entire group.
from the group.
Got it.
And then I
Read
said
the
by
iPhone?
Monday,
We can
now, I
try.
can give you guys more time, but I try to do this to give you guys more time to then develop from there.
Yeah.
And I said, by Monday, have the annotated bibliography. But you guys can see my speed of reading if you don't, you know, if this is in journalism class, if you guys get it in Tuesday or something, that's fine. I think I had originally, well, the syllabus, no, I made it Thursday. I made it next week because the syllabus says you have a week between when you get your proposal in and when you get your annotated bibliography. So
Wow.
actually, well, Lima says, and everything's set
Worked.
up for Thursday proposal,
UH, okay.
next Thursday annotated
Was there-
bibliography. If you guys want to bundle them together, you need to,
Yeah.
that's okay.
We're done, I'm just,
Yeah, because I wasn't sure if it's gonna be like a PowerPoint presentation or it's
No.
gonna be like a written form of.
No, if you look on the Lima and on the syllabus,
It's a Word document.
yeah, and the description on there tells you what to put, how to put it together.
I think it said that you have to turn in a literature piece, but I don't know, I've just never written a literature review first and then annotated it first, so I don't know if
Not really. No. But except that, I mean, the annotated bibliography would be more nuts and bolts. The literature review is like a discussion of how it comes together. So you're saying, in a literature review, you're saying,
You already have existing research for the literature.
a literature review is when generally you write them for scholarship, you say, here's kind of what's known, here's the insights, here's what we're adding to that's new. to what's already been out there. Or
Yeah.
here's where we found a gap, or we tied it all together and had it.
Okay, so it loaded.
Bibliography is
I
just
think,
like,
yeah, we'll just talk to it.
and the next bibliography is just like, we're using this source, and this is, it's valuable for this. Here's 2 sentences about why this source is valuable. Here's this source.
Is it working?
here's why it's
It
valuable.
works.
Okay.
Just nuts and bolts.
Okay, so look,
I'll be first, and then it'll help us with our literature review, but
Let's check it out.
That's fine, like, we'll work.
Well, yeah, I
Well,
mean, that's true. You
Yeah,
can do it
I
that
mean,
way.
both are.
You guys know.
So, we'll just do both.
I mean, if you want to turn them both in next Thursday, you know, not this Thursday, but the next Thursday, that's fine.
Okay.
Thank you,
Whatever.
Dr. Dewey.
Yeah, I didn't really think about that. That's a good point.
Okay, so
Appreciate it, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, just
so
wanna-
what you was gonna show?
okay, so this worked. It worked because we got off UH's and let me use their hotspot. So like this is like a very, very, very useful tool for you to be able to study history, you know, in the built environment, where it's like, okay, you know, we have a map from 1900, right? And we're literally like overlapping it perfectly with a map box, Google Map, you know, where you can kind of like, you know, really start to see, especially if you're looking at, imagine like looking at like fire insurance maps from like 1880s all the way to the 1950s. You have like 3 maps on top of each other, or you're just trying to understand, hey, what was here before, right? What was here? Or when was this building built? Or, you know, how does the old built environment relate to the new built environment, right? Like those things are pretty, you know, if you took a 100-year-old map of Waikiki versus today,
You probably saw some murders.
you might, yeah, but you might not know, you know, you might go walk around a place, right? There's like the foot research of mapping, right? Like the flaneur, like go out and find it, right? But then looking at the bird's eye view, it really reveals a lot of, you know, what was here, when did it get built, you know, what structures remain, right? Those things are interesting. Like what remains from 1900 still, you know, and we can kind of pull back on that and kind of understand how lots worked, where streets were named something different, but are named something different now. You know, and I could see this being, for media history students, being a super interesting way of engaging with maps. And, you know, this is a very challenging thing to do if you don't have a resource like this. And he does it like on the fly, you know, and you can bring in any map and you can drop it in and you just find 3 points of connection. And I can show you, we can do it another day. I can do a Zoom.
I mean, I would say this map is media,
Yes.
is your media thing. You know,
No, I mean-
maybe not media history,
And-
but you're being a media person.
And like for Alexandria, he didn't even bring in all the maps he could, because sometimes it gets a little crazy, because sometimes when you're doing a study, you're only working on one neighborhood. He's doing like the whole city of Alexandria. And then there's like a key map. That's an older map that helps him bring in, you know, like that's the key map.
And you know, you find when you do this kind of stuff, like, I think we think, oh, we'll get more busy and populated over time, so everything's gonna be really simple and farm-like back then. Back then, you know, when there weren't all these roads connecting, a lot of times, small town cities like Alexandria were much bigger and busier than they are now. Because now there's so much suburban sprawl.
Yeah.
That the actual urban center of a town like Alexandria, I've lived in these places, and they're all hollowed out. But, you know, 50 or 100 years ago, they were like bustling places, you know?
That's an interesting feature to have, definitely.
Well, the point of this is not just to study it, but then you can create and export your own map so that you can bring it into your digital humanities.
Exactly, yeah.
And that's the thing that's valuable, is like, you know, you might be studying.
Tailor to yourself and whatever you are looking for.
And there's a lot of functionality to it, yeah.
All right, guys.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Oh, yeah, you bet.
Thank you, guys.
Thank
I wanna
you.
let you know.
Always a pleasure. I love this class.
Awesome class.
I forgot to submit one.
Yeah, you can, especially because I've been so slow on the feedback.
That's good.
You know? Yeah, if I'm bad,
I'm Mr.
then,
Moore.
you
Oh,
know.
sorry. And guess what? He just got back to me. Allmaps.org. Go to that, check it out. Allmaps.org. Yeah, that's the one where you can pull any map.
And I am working, I got a new deadline. I'm just trying to juggle my own research with the grade.
Take your time.
Okay. So maybe do it before.
Yeah, so, but if you guys have any questions, so if there's anything that from my lack of feedback.
No, I think your feedback is really good, though. I appreciate the comments that you got.
Oh,
It's
yeah?
really helpful.
Okay, cool.
I like that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. G.
Yeah.
Have a good one.
Yeah.
Bye.
Make sure you bring your umbrella.
Oh, gosh.
Oh, maybe this week, it's a,
Yeah, I could probably go on and on and on and on and on.
What?
It's interesting to get a grant for a project that you like throw an idea at somebody and then they're like,
Because he was, there's a tornado.
Oh my God, what?
Tornadoes coming to We don't have anything like that out here.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't even know what we're gonna find. You know, one of the maps that I found that I can't wait to do something with is an oil drilling well map.
I mean, I live on the
Where
water.
Primary well is.
Yeah, I have a
It shows,
eye
like,
right
it
on
has, like,
the,
rates
on
that come out.
the,
And
canal.
it shows like where all the other wells are.
Yeah, I gotta probably
And
pack
so, but
stuff.
it was published in the newspapers in like 1895. It was in the paper, and it was like a full page. And they published the map of the oil drilling wells. That would never happen today.
Yeah, it's like
It
top
would never,
secret.
it would never happen today.
Yeah, no.
That's really cool. Like, you know, that thing alone, when we show that to them, and we like tether it to an environment, they're gonna just be blown away. They're gonna be like, oh my God, what? I think they're gonna be fascinated by the existence of that map. By itself. Yeah, exactly. Like, why would they publish an oil well drilling map in the newspaper? But it might have gone back to, they might have had to do it for legal purposes. It might have been like a legal notice, right? Where they had. to
You know, the
publish
one
it.
thing that was really interesting though, was that
At that time.
you had said in your paper
Oh,
about
yeah.
carrying